Hello again, and today again is an auspicious day. It's Indian Independence Day, 75th anniversary. You probably know, and it's I think it's particularly relevant that we're learning from a book which is almost entirely using Indian sources, mainly from the as well as the Buddhist sutras, but also from scholars, Indian scholars from about the 3rd century, like Asanga, all the way, and Nagarjuna in the 1st century AD, all the way through to about the 10th or 11th, um, uh, uh, after which Buddhism, as we know, declined quite severely for several centuries. So this is very nice. There's a couple of bits in this particular chapter which really refer to Indian historic culture from those years, and it was I had to do some sleuthing, but it was very interesting. Anyway, so before we start, let's just set the motivation and remember why we're here, what we're doing our best to work on our minds, train our minds as much as we are able um, to just become a little bit better, if nothing else, just to help inspire us to take what we can from this today, to inspire us to bring a little bit more joy, or a little bit more happiness into the world, and bring a little bit maybe a bit more vigilance and mindfulness in our actions, so that we're a bit more aware, is this the right thing to do? Just enough for us to be able to think, maybe every now and then catch an emotion, and that's all we could, that's enough. But of course, our primary goal is in Mahayana is to become Buddhists, and eventually become Buddhas. But if we don't recognize the consequences of our actions, then that really is very hard for us to get there. So let's work on this. Yeah, that's my motivation. And today, this is the culmination of the Four Noble Truths as presented by Lama Tsongkhapa in the Lam Rim Chenmo, and the culmination of the middle scope, or the sort of the main bulk, if you like, or the body of the pyramid leading up to the apex. And this is the tradition so far that's primarily shared with the Theravadins. In other words, the non-Mahayana and the Mahayana schools, or Buddhist schools, share these thoughts. And what we are left with is essentially, although we've talked about the number of the 3 higher trainings, why there are 3, and the order in which they appear, he now actually talks about the nature of the path. The true path is the 3 trainings, although they're often revealed in Pali Sutras through the Eightfold Path, which are well known. In fact, the teachings to the monks and the nuns, and also actually built in behind the Eightfold Path is the actual practice itself to liberation, which are the three higher trainings. Just to remind ourselves, this is ethical discipline, or is one of the many ways of which we call it concentration, or the development of concentration in terms of meditative stability, and then wisdom and understanding the nature of reality, and we'll go into that. And in fact, of course, this is exactly how Lama Tsongkhapa starts the chapter, saying that what he does is he breaks this down in according to the sutra requested by Brahma, which is a sutra from Sangha and Maitreya. Ethical discipline has 6 branches, which he'll go into. The concentration is the 4 blissful abodes, and these are to do with the 4 types of bliss that we are able to achieve once we have reached meditative stabilization. I think he might talk about this a little bit, but he'll go in a huge amount more detail about this later on. And then the 4 aspects of the 4 Noble Truths is the pure sublime wisdoms, and he'll go into that too. So there are different ways in which the presentation of ethical discipline are done, but in terms of the 6 branches. But what he's chosen to do here is, rather than just define them according to the original text, is he's tried to describe them to us. And he says that the 6 branches, in one sense, is the possession of a possession of self-discipline, being aware of the need to take control of, or be aware of, and apply correct behavior, both of the body, speech, and all of the body, speech, and mind. And this is the first. And the second branch is going to be restraint by vows. So this is where we take vows, either the lay vows or the vows of a monk or a nun, or also the Mahayana Bodhisattva vows. And these help us demonstrate pure ethical discipline, so not just our own nature of the ethics, but also taking on the vows. And this certainly, especially the vows of individual liberation, will enable us to provide the platform for us to achieve liberation, freedom. Yeah, freedom. This is like very nice. We were talking about freedom from British rule, but here we're talking about freedom from, because it's Indian Independence Day, but here we're talking about freedom from samsara. And then he says there's also the subsequent 2, in terms of the base branches of ethical discipline, are the periodic practices of a monk, such as the full moon and new moon practices and so on, but also general daily practice. So the commitments that we have for daily practice, and our consistency to apply daily practice, as well as also a possession of the range of support, helps us develop unimpeachable discipline, which is the sustaining of practice, and pure ethical discipline, which is through having the range of support. Now, range of support, which we've talked about earlier on, is having a supporting teacher, supporting family, supporting culture, supporting a community. So these sorts of things help us very much, and also supporting resources and a supporting body that we're in. So different ways in which these range of support provides us, gives us a privilege which we've got to recognize that we have, and then, because we have this privilege, which so many others don't, to be able to seize the opportunity that privilege gives us rather than waste it. So this is one of the aspects of range of support, is that gives us the ability to actually sustain pure ethical discipline. So then the 5th is to sustain caution, a strong caution of even the smallest misdeed, and this is in order for us to this is based upon the fact that we recognize the consequences of action. So this is primarily about insight into the nature of why we're doing this, not just doing it because Ben or Buddha says so, doing it because we see that the damaging consequences directly ourselves. So we don't necessarily need to see into future lives, but we can be aware of the fact that loose lips sink ships, but also in terms of what we say or what we do, and how this may disempower or harm other people, right? So these are two of the aspects we're looking at, where we do not want to disempower or harm. And then again, so even the smallest, and then lastly, sustaining and undertaking training in the fundamental training. So the fundamental trainings here primarily are going to be the 5 lay vows, but also the teachings that we've covered so far in this volume, such as being aware of our precious human rebirth, being aware of the nature of the 4 noble truths, the importance of the teacher, karma, and so on. So this here is what provides us with the fundamental training, and most importantly, the 12 interdependent links, and how the mechanism by which we are bound to, the engine by which we are bound to samsara, provides us with the insight that we need to be able to be free thinking in our understanding of discipline. So it's really important for us to not just be told, but to see it for ourselves, to recognize it for ourselves. And this is what we're working on, is this change from migrating our mind from accepting it because it's written or because our teachers tell us, to recognizing it and experiencing it and then validating it so that we have no doubt in our minds about this. And the more we're able to do that, the more we are realized. And this is what realization means, which I said back in January or February. So yeah, so then there are 4 abodes of mind in the concentration, which is he refers to. These are the concentration. So we've done a brief aspect of the discipline of the first, and now we're looking at the concentration. And the concentration it is divided into 4, and these primarily the 4 meditative stabilizations. There are 4 stations, types of 4 meditative levels involved in, once we've achieved shine or shamatha, once we've achieved the training, the calming of the mind, we are then at the first of the 4 form realm stabilizations. And then there are also another 4 formless realm stabilizations. And if we were to stay in solely in meditation and meditative states, we could quite easily move from the first, the second, to the third, to the 4th of the meditative stabilizations. But within Buddhism, we generally stay with the first. The recognition, however, of this is that each of these 4 of the form level meditations, there's a very, very deep level of mental stability. There is an accompanying great bliss, fit and real mental and physical bliss, experiential bliss. And this persists when even between meditation sessions, is this sense of power, of control, of meditative power, ability and facility. We have this incredible facility with our minds after training. And importantly with this, this is not easy to achieve, but importantly with this is that we can also lose it. It can slip. So we have to, once we're developed in Shine, we have to sustain that development. Otherwise, it can go quite easily. So then Rinpoche says, well, okay, so that's the concentration level. He doesn't go into it in great detail. And then he talks about the 16 divisions of the 4 Noble Truths. So there are 4 of each, 4 in each of the 4 Noble Truths of Buddha. And I had to take a little bit of a time considering this. And of the 4 Noble Truths, we have the suffering and the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering. We have the truth of cessation of nirvana, and the truth of the path to nirvana. These are our 4 truths. And the truth of suffering refers primarily to, which we have covered. We've covered in a huge amount of detail over the last few weeks. Impermanence, the nature of permanence, the nature of the fact that suffering is built into samsara, into our bodies. And also this is primarily when it's talked about here, the suffering here refers to the fact that it's ignorance and afflictions together, and karma and no, it is ignorance and our disturbing afflictions, which are cause provide this suffering. Emptiness is a suffering in terms of the fact there's no self, there's nothing that we can pinpoint, there's no essence. of being, either externally or internally. In this case, when we're talking about emptiness, this is outside of the person. So anything that we look at is empty of value, of essence. So there's without getting too carried away, in Western philosophy, there's something called Sorites, which means the heap. And the idea is, if you put a grain of rice on the table, or a grain of sand on the table, one at a time, when does a heap arise? Yeah. So with one rice, there's no heap. Two rice, there's no heap. Five rice, maybe there's no heap. Maybe 100 rice, then you have a heap. Yeah. So how has this heap arisen? This is one of the ways of being able to look at emptiness, of saying that the essence of heap doesn't suddenly manifest when a heap arises, right? It's not like there's some sort of heap soul coming down into this. And this is essentially what's being talked about in terms of emptiness. And then the fourth of the truth of suffering is selflessness, which is there is no self to be found either within ourselves, within the person. So this is to say that although we talk about myself, and we talk about um, you know, soul wrenching or whatever, there's no soul in Buddhism. There's mind and there's body, and the mind is made up of different parts. The body is made up of different parts, and it's the aggregate, just like the heap. It's the aggregate of these pieces that makes the person. But that person isn't. There's no essence there. It's just an attribution that we give, a label, if you like, that we give to a person, a reference point. So this is the truth of the four aspects of the truth of suffering. Then again, the truth of origin, this is the origin of suffering, it refers to the karma this time actions, and as well as the afflictions. And then we have the causes. So this is the causes of suffering, which is the karma. This is karma and action, and contaminated action, and the associated afflictions, mental problems. The recognizing the origin as this in terms of the four aspects of the truth of origin. The truth of the origin is karma klesha. It's a cause. It's the one that causes suffering. It's the origin of the suffering. That's the second point. It also forcefully continues to produce this suffering. And likewise, it's not just the cause of suffering, it is also the condition, in a sense that it's a contributing cause, and therefore also karma and klesha become an effect of prior karma klesha. This is the problem. Klesha, sorry, is affliction, just another word for mental disturbances. Then the four aspects of cessation. Cessation meaning here is nirvana, or freedom from suffering, or liberation. Yeah, liberation, freedom, and recognizing that there are four aspects to this. One of them is that it's a true cessation. It is totally the end of suffering in this mind stream. There is no more suffering available to this mind stream ever again, ever. Pacification, which is the quality that there's no more torment left. There is no no disturbance left. There is what it remains is peace, and a peace and comfort. Being superb, being beyond, being supreme in its quality of freedom as a source of happiness, in terms of the removal, cessation of misery. And then the fourth aspect is its definite emergence, which is that when we practice it, it definitely arises, and as it definitely arises, it will have the definite effect of releasing us from samsara. And then the truth of the path, the four aspects of this, which refer to the three higher trainings, is that the path, the aspect of the path is that it is a path. It's a true path that leads to cessation. The quality of awareness that it brings us to a experiential understanding, not just a scriptural or an academic or a theoretical, an experiential, direct experience of understanding of the path itself, of the Dhamma. Achievement, which is the nature of the fact that it brings us, it takes us from where we are not to somewhere that we are, and deliverance in terms of the fact that it frees us, that it's the destination of the path is this cessation, is this freedom. So this is those are the four aspects, the Four Noble Truths. And I used a piece of paper to help me with this because Je Rinpoche just has the words, each of these words, and it's important to have some sort of meaning to them as well. Now he says, okay, having done that and having concentrated on these 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, which are considered to be the training in wisdom. So the training in wisdom is not just emptiness, it's actually understanding all the different aspects of and experiencing the aspects of the Four Noble Truths. When we have this, then one of the aspects of that specifically is emptiness or insight. So he says, if I was going to be, if this text that I'm writing here was just to do was not to include Mahayana, then this would be the right time, having for me to, as well as discuss ethics, also to discuss wisdom and serenity or concentration. But I'm going to do that in a huge amount of detail later on in terms of the higher scope, so in the Mahayana tradition. And because there is no difference between the training in mind of stability, and there is no difference in terms of the nature of insight, in terms of emptiness, there's no reason for him to put them into just this. He's going to do it in the next. However, there are some aspects of the Mahayana ethics which are not shared with the middle scope, with the Theravada. They're specifically to do with bodhicitta and the training of a bodhisattva. Those aspects which are specific to unshared with the Theravadan or non-Mahayana traditions. Therefore, it is worthwhile also talking about the ethics that are shared. And so he says, for the rest of this chapter, I'm going to talk about the ethics which are shared with the Mahayana, because the Mahayana also has its own ethics as well, which it does not have for concentration and for wisdom. So concentration and wisdom is shared completely. There's no distinction whatsoever to be made between the Mahayana and the non-Mahayana. It is only the practice of ethics which is distinct between the Mahayana and non-Mahayana. Yeah. Primarily, the primary distinction, which he will talk about next semester, is to do with bodhicitta, to do with the mind of enlightenment. But what Je Rinpoche wants to do here is to talk about ethics which are shared in general between the Mahayana and non-Mahayana Buddhist schools. So he spent a lot of time already talking about being good, what it means to be good. And we will be doing even more from the Mahayana position. And he says he hasn't really yet stopped. So this is, in a sense, being good, doing the best we can with what we have is the Buddhist path, right? So he says it is important for us to repeatedly reflect on the benefits of having an ethical discipline, and likewise, for us to develop enthusiasm for sustaining a discipline, an ethical discipline, being good, being a good person. And he quotes the Great Final Nirvana Sutra says, ethical discipline is the ladder to all virtues. It is the foundation of all virtues, just as the earth is the foundation for plants and buildings. Just as a master trader goes first among all traders So ethical discipline goes first among all virtues. Since it is discipline which cures the illness of all our misdoings, it is like a medical plant, medicinal plant, sorry. Um, it's the stock of provisions for the terrible road of cyclic existence. It is the weapon that destroys the afflictions, our enemies. Well, most of our afflictions, yeah. And it is the spell that destroys the. It is the bridge that gives us the basis to cross over the waters of misdoing. And Nagarjuna, he then just cites again, repeating from Nagarjuna, who everybody likes a lot. Nagarjuna says ethical discipline is said to be the foundation of all good qualities. And then he also cites the Tantra requested by Subahu. So the whole point about this is for us to develop an appreciation of and an enthusiasm for ethical discipline. Is as just as every harvest grows without fault and dependence upon earth, so too the greatest virtues depend upon ethical discipline and grow by being moistened with the water of compassion. So one of the things here is that, as we mentioned earlier, it's not possible for us to achieve meditative stabilization or clear insight without discipline. We need to have the discipline to provide the facility, the calm enough mind for us to be able to develop the focus, to develop this mental pliancy, the ability to use our mind freely and to be actually take ownership of or to sustain our minds. So initially, self-discipline is primarily about reducing the large stress, the sort of the storm in a teacup that is our minds at the moment, is continually going all over the place. And through being able to sustain a healthy mind and healthy actions, the storm abates. And then we can begin to work on um, on on dissipating the clouds and dissipating the energy that's creating all the waves all the time and keeping us from being able to see clearly until we actually end up with a calm water. And with a calm water, then everything can settle. And as it settles, we develop this incredible clarity. So ethical discipline is absolutely necessary in every aspect of our path. So he says, this way we also need to think about saying, he says, there's another sutra that says if we have taken vows, this goes two ways. If we're able to keep it, it leads to joy. But if we are not able to keep it, it leads to trouble for us. So those who possess, sustain their vows are happy, but those who are not able to sustain their vows suffer. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes it is not a good idea for us to take vows, because if we take the vows and we're not able to sustain them, then we're actually going to have more trouble than if we hadn't taken them at all. If we are able to take them, we have the strength of that commitment behind us. Now, you might argue, well, is there any magic here? And the magic is no. But if you imagine that when we have managed to sustain, let's say, um, uh, not drinking or non-hostility, even let's say, and or non-criticism in our what we say. If we're able to sustain this for so many months because we have a vow with it, we've taken a vow not to do it. When that arises, or the potential arises, then there is a greater strength for us to turn away from it. Yeah, because we've got this record and this mind that we've set, the vow that we've set. If, however, we break our vow, then the strength of that vow is weakened because we have not kept to it, and so it loses its value. And more to the point, and I think this is really important, is that it weakens the nature of that we have, our mental expectation of vows, so of ourselves. So all of our vows are weakened. And this is why, in a sense, one of the problems about it is to say that if we make a vow, we keep a vow. Yeah, it's not easy to do. But there are some advantages, because then it's like, this is where I've drawn the line. This is where I've drawn the line. It's like drawing a line in sort of politics or whatever. It's exactly the same thing. So he says also we need to think, therefore, about the drawbacks of not keeping self-discipline. This is a very typical Lamrim meditation practice. First of all, thinks about the benefits, then think about of doing it, and then think about the drawbacks of not doing it, so on. And he says, and it's important for us to recognize also the causes of an infraction of the four. He says in Numbers again. He sort of says there are four causes of an infraction: not knowing it, not knowing the precept that we've taken, carelessness, disrespect, and various different afflictions. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not saying, and I don't think Je Rinpoche is really saying this is the only four there are. But what he's saying is a good way of us being able to look at and explore the different ways in which we can break a vow or lose our control. And he says, not knowing it, the remedy for not knowing the precept, not understanding what it is that we should not be doing, such as non-killing, is to listen and understand the nature of it, as well as the purpose of it. So this is why we were doing um, uh, um, discussing things like the 10 non-virtuous actions, right? So months ago. So the idea here is to say, if we know what the fact that killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and so on are and why they're bad, then we know whether or not we've committed a breach. So this is not knowing it. Carelessness, right? Um, is where we're not really being mindful or vigilant, right? So essentially, if we're not being aware of what it is we're doing, and our minds are distracted, or we're tired, or we're very tired, and we're just like saying, oh, blah 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 blah, and then it's like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, right? So this is carelessness, and then the importance here is to recognize, especially our triggers, like when we're tired, or when we're an intense situation, a complicated situation where we're uncomfortable. Then this is where we really need to start exercising our vigilance and our mindfulness about what it is we're saying. And I remember Geshe saying, in general, it's good to think zip lip. I mean, just keep, do your best to think it's better. If I'm not in a comfortable situation, if I'm not in control, keep it zipped. Yeah. Because all sorts of rubbish comes out. And then you have to deal with all that rubbish. So it's best for us to be very careful, especially when we're particularly fatigued, or if we're stressed, or if we're in some sort of level of discomfort, but also anyway, in general, is carelessness. So he also says, as well as this, then also to have a development, develop a sense of embarrassment. Like if I'm a leader, or I'm trying to set an example, to feel embarrassed if I make a mistake, right? Thinking, everybody else. So this is really, in a sense, if I've not got clear view or clear insight into it, but I know that it's wrong, I is to help me to, rather than necessarily always thinking about consequences, to think, well, actually it's just letting the side down. Yeah. So using these mechanisms like this can also help. And then, although in fairness, what one should not be doing, although he says they use this is a translation thing where they talk about fearing the future, is not fear the future, but to be cautious, and to recognize the inevitability of the consequences of actions. So it's to say, when we are cautious, if we're able to think, if I say this, I may well have to deal with some pretty heavy consequences. This is in this life, not necessarily the future lives. Yeah, in this life, I will have to deal with all sorts of consequences from this single action, this single statement I've made. I know it's easy to do. You do it all the time. So this is carelessness. Yeah, I need to work on this one. And then disrespect is to not recognize and or not to recall the importance of the Dharma that we're practicing. This is really when it comes down to how sincere we are in our practice, how much we really recognize the need for us to sustain Dharma practice from moment to moment, right? As practitioners, sincere practitioners, we should not miss a moment. We should be always sustaining respect for the Dharma, and therefore respect for our ethical position within the Dharma. And this is also true in terms of looking at the vows. So if we don't have respect for the Dharma, then we don't have respect for the vows, or we don't have respect for the precepts, and then it's very hard for us to sustain them. So it says one of the aspects of this is to check yourself daily, or to make sure that you do have respect for the Dharma, you do recognize yourself as a sincere practitioner, and then think, okay, well, I need to be, I'm slipping, or I need to work harder on this. If I do. And Rinpoche says if you and then also he says for various afflictions, then we should always be essentially looking when afflictions dominate, like a hostility, fury, jealousy, uh, um, um, pride, um, uh, lethargy, if you like, laziness or whatever. When we see these, is then to try to think, okay, well, there it is. Now I need to apply the remedy for that, right? The remedy for this is, for instance, for jealousy or envy, is to rejoice in what this other person has rather than feel they shouldn't have it, right? The wish to punish somebody. This is a type of hostility. It's like they should be punished, right? This is a type of hostility, is to think, um, this is a terribly unfortunate thing, but that's done. But it's done by their delusions. What we want to do is to work on how to free them from their delusions, not just give them a whack around the head with a stick. Yeah. So important for us to think how best to apply this. It's very easy to think, oh, they should be locked up forever, or whatever. It's very easy for us to do that in our mind. And then he says, if we're lax in our practice, this is very dangerous, especially for monks, or if we have vows as bodhisattva vows, or the tantric vows as well as the monastic vows. It's like if we make a small fault, not to address it, just to think, oh, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. And he then takes something which comes to the Vinaya, which is those who take lightly and slightly transgress the teaching of the compassionate teacher, um, come under the power of suffering, and similar to the one who cuts a grove of small bamboo and spoils a whole grove of mango. Now this is quite difficult to understand why cutting a grove of bamboo would spoil a whole grove of mango. Um, um, but I think what this means is if one's just hacking away without thinking about what one's hacking away at, then one could knock down the mango as well as the bamboo. Um, And it says also, it's important to remember that if there are UK law, for instance, or a modern law legal system, if we make a small mistake, then generally we don't get much punishment. We might be given a caution or whatever for a small transgression. But to transgress even the smaller aspects of the Buddha, he says, can lead us to become animals like the Naga Elapatra. Now, Naga Elapatra is famous, a legendary Naga king, that is found in many Buddhist sutras and also Hindu scriptures, who lived in, I think, it was meant to live close to the Ganges. and he had one of the aspects he had was a cardamom tree growing on his head. So the naga is like a big snake, a huge snake, many miles long. This snake, and he had a tree, a cardamom tree growing out of his head, and it gave him bad headaches. And apparently, the reason for this, within the Buddhist context anyway, was that in the previous Buddha, um, he was a monk in the previous Buddha, before Shakyamuni Buddha, and he was on a boat in the river Ganges, and his robe was torn off by a branch of a cardamom tree that was stretched over the river. And he jumped off to grab the rope and was so infuriated he chopped the tree down. Now, in Vinaya, Buddhist Vinaya, you're not a monk isn't meant to be chopping trees down. So this was the minor breach, and he didn't confess it. He was furious about it, and he didn't confess it, and so he was reborn with a tree growing out of his head. So this is the story, anyway. I don't know. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe it's a very very traditional Indian story. Um, So going back to our practice, right? So we should meet the need. So there are different ways in which we can address infractions, such as confession, or using resolve, or purification, or to whatever. But generally, he says, you should do your very best to sustain it, not let it go. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So he says also, again, talking about losing our life, losing our discipline at risk of our life. He said, if we lose our life and we die, it's not a huge issue, but to lose our discipline is a big issue. He says losing our life is something that is just expending the span of our lifetime, of our rebirth. We'll be reborn again. But if we lose our ethical discipline, we lose our lineage of karma is destroyed. The benefits that we're giving is destroyed, and therefore we actually end up with a downfall. And then this is again addressing primarily monks, but also something that we can consider as lay people. He said, if you've gone into, if you sort of don't practice ethical discipline as a monk or a nun, and you've got all these robes on, it's like saying, well, if I'm not going to keep my discipline, why am I spending my life with my head shaved and wearing red robes or robes? It makes no sense, right? And the King of Concentration Sutra says, if you have renounced and gone forth into the Buddha's teachings, um, and then you just you are fascinated by horses and oxen, chariots, and and interested in how much wealth or grain there are available. Why did you make so much effort in training your heads? Right? In shaving your heads, where's your training? You've trained in nothing. And it's very, what I like about this is that this is written like well long ago, like 2000 years ago. And yet, being fascinated by fast cars was still a major thing, right? Oh, look at that chariot. Was still an important aspect of people's lives, even 2000 years ago. And now it's like, oh yeah, Lamborghini or whatever. It's exactly the same. Our minds haven't changed that much, right? There's just a little bit of the technology has changed. Yeah. And it's like, oh, get more money. Yeah, loads of money. Exactly the same. And it's they're saying that, if you're a monk and you're doing this, you're thinking about fast cars and lots of dollars. What's the point? It's true for us too, though, and us lay people is what's the point? It's just not doing anything is no value. And again, he says in the sutras, so he says, I gave talks, I gave trainings to householders wearing secular clothes, like normal clothes, and at that time, these five vows, right? Um, the five basic fundamental trainings of not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to drink, alcohol and not to have commit adultery and other sexual improprieties. So these things are 5 basic things. And he said, this time even the monks weren't able to do this. Yeah. So it's like saying, if the monks can't do even this, why be a monk? And he says, but now, specifically, when even the monks are unable to sustain these 5 trainings that were given to the lay people, the effort that we make in terms of our practice is even more important. As Buddhism declines, as the support becomes less, the more the our abilities become harder and harder and harder, and our ability, if any ability that we have to sustain, to maintain Buddhist practice, anything at all we can do, has a much greater effect than it would 2,500 years ago when Buddha was around. And this is because Buddha's not here now. But I mean, Buddha's teachings is left, but um, we have to stand alone. And what we can do, what we can offer to the society that we're around, is essentially to do our best to make a difference, to change minds in terms of recognizing the importance of being good, recognizing the shallowness of self-centered acquisitional mind. Right? This is something we don't have to do it by going around preaching it. We do it by showing it, by setting an example. And this is incredibly valuable, incredibly valuable. And he says here in this sutra, he says, for 10 million eons, for as many grains as there are grains of sand in the Ganges, I served food and drink, and offered parasols and umbrellas, banners and processions of lamps to many Buddhas. But so much greater is the merit of a practitioner of a single training of day and night at a time when the teaching is perishing, and at the time when the Buddha's teaching is coming to an end. So we often feel like we can't do very much, but whatever we do is of value, right? That doesn't mean we should, oh, well, I'm done. I've done my own money, pay me home, so I'm done. That's not that's not what I'm saying. But the fact that we're even interested in trying to sustain a mind of a sincere practitioner, this is extremely valuable, very valuable quality. So then he talks about confession, saying, well, especially again as a monk, is like you might say, well, if I make an infraction, if I break my vow, I can always confess it, so that's all right. And he says, but the point is this: you're lacking an attitude of restraint, and this is absolutely relevant, because it will prevent you. It's the restraint that will prevent you from acting, from committing the same action again. So he said, this is, Je Rinpoche says, this is like eating poison and saying, yeah, well, I can always take the antidote later, which is sort of missing the point. It's not really going to be healthy to keep on eating the poison just because I can always take the antidote later. And then he cites a sutra from where this comes from. And again, he says, another site is when he's talking to Maitreya, he says, what I call poison in the noble teachings, Buddha saying this, of noble teaching of the discipline is transgressing the fundamental trainings as I've given them. Therefore, do not eat such poison. Now, Rinpoche says this is also true for the mantra vehicle and also for the Mahayana vehicle. Just because this is about monks does not mean that it's solely about monks. It's also about anybody who's taking vows or anybody who's trying to practice sincerely. Um, in fact, he says in a Tantra request by Sabahu, he says, of the entire discipline that I taught, the pure ethical discipline is relevant to a household practitioner of mantra, right? except for the signs, the robes and the rituals, such as the 15th day and 30th day confessions and so on, and of a monk and nun. So in a sense, it's saying, yeah, this is still relevant. It actually says not just the vows, but also the vows of the discipline of the discipline or attitude of a monk or a nun. Again, the root of mantra vehicle is ethical discipline. So why is he talking about this? Because at the time in the 14th century in Tibet, there were lots of people who were not recognizing that that the tantric path also included needing to be following the same ethical discipline. They didn't see it; they saw it as being completely separate. And one of the aspects of what Je Rinpoche, in fact, Atisha, the Indian Atisha, and his followers, including Lama Tsongkhapa, was there is no tantra, there is no practice without ethical discipline. And then he quotes Kamlungpa. When a famine occurs, everything and everybody is concerned with food, right? And he says, in the practice of teaching, everything revolves around ethical discipline. Therefore, if we can remember this, that in a famine it's food, in our practice it's ethics, then we begin to understand exactly why we need to practice it. If we do not think about our actions and the consequences of our actions, we cannot achieve pure ethical discipline. And again, this is like saying if you can see it, if you're able to understand why you need to do this, then that's fantastic. Then you know to do it. If you don't, then you do need to rely upon text. You need to rely upon teachers to help you understand what to do or what not to do. Yeah, so here, Geshe Dontonpa says, this is a teacher's student. He says there's a group that say that when you rely upon discipline, you discard the practice of mantra. And when you rely upon the mantra, you discard the rules of discipline. He says, but this is not a tradition that I can recognize. And then Tisha himself, who was the founder of the text that this is based on, he says, when I was back in India, there are sometimes unexpected things or new issues arose, and that came to us Indians, he says. And then what we would do is everybody who upheld the scriptural collections, in other words, the senior monks, would assemble and determine whether these things were in line with the scriptural collections, the Vinaya, or against them. And based on this, we made decisions as a group. But in addition to that, those of us from Vikramasila, which is a Mahayana a community, were also concerned that this was truthful with the Bodhisattva's activities and that there was no contradiction with those either. Nonetheless, it was the Vinaya monks, the senior Vinaya monks, who made the final decisions. So this is a way of saying, look, this is really not even at a personal, but also at a political or social level. This is really what we should be looking at. Mhm. Oh, yeah. So with regard to keeping ethical discipline and keeping our practice, he said right now in our moments, the main our main struggle, our main journey, our struggle is an internal struggle with with our afflictions, with our mind, trying to keep our mind controlled. And it's this struggle, this continual mindfulness and vigilance that we're working with, which will help us achieve a ethical discipline. If we do not do that, we cannot expect to grow, we cannot expect to overturn them, and we will lose our ability to sustain or develop the concentration and wisdom that bring us through to enlightenment itself. He said further, we must see every affliction as this mental disturbance, as an enemy, and attack it as soon as it arises in our mind. We talked about this not so long ago. Otherwise, if we sort of get weak and let it go by, we end up nurturing it, and it becomes stronger and deeper and harder for us to eliminate. And then Je Rinpoche says also, like, we've got to remember that if we don't manage to stop them initially, through our mindfulness, we mustn't allow them to linger. No lingering, right? We must immediately disperse these feelings, these disturbing emotions, as if they were drawings in water. But don't let them be. So don't let them be like drawings in stone. So we get fixated. Let's say somebody really annoys us. We get fixated with it, and we keep on coming back to it again. This is like drawing it in stone. It's like if we draw it in air, we can't even see it for very long. Or draw it in water, the ripples finish very, very quickly. So this is like, okay, well, I got angry, but just like don't hang on to it. Don't turn it into stone, right? Stone is how we become very bitter, very destroyed. Our mind becomes destroyed by holding on to our afflictions like stone, writing in stone. That woman, that man, that man, that organization, whatever it is. Every time I come back, it comes back, right? This here is like drawing in stone, and got to try and stop this. Nagarjuna says in his friendly letter, he says exactly that. Know that the mind can be like a drawing made in water, in earth, or in stone. But when afflictions arise, when these strong emotions arise, it's best to have the first, which water, it's drawn in water. But when we're doing our practice, write it in stone. So Shantideva says there's sometimes there are afflictions we can use to destroy other afflictions, then that's okay. There are temporary allies, yeah. Sometimes we can use fear, for instance, if we are unable to sustain a strong understanding, we can use fear for a little bit, but like in order to determine self, yeah. Then in this case, we can still say they're our temporary ally, but they're not going to be our permanent ally. They're just temporary, and if they come in the wrong place, or then chop chop chop, no good at all, right? And then Geshe Puchung was saying, here's another Tibetan Geshe, he's saying that when I'm buried under the afflictions, I can still clench my teeth beneath them. It's like, bound by his furies and his hostility and his jealousy and his everything else. He says, I can still clench my teeth, like I don't feel comfortable here. And when Bodawa heard that, as a teacher heard this, he said, well, if you're doing this, then you're stopping them. You're breaking them, which is great. So even if all you can do is clench your teeth, I mean, not literally, you don't want to give yourself jaw ache, but to recognize that you don't want to be related to this, then you are actually helping to destroy them. And then Rinpoche says, well, we're talking about this metaphor of how our destructive minds are like enemies. He says, when you are able to turn aside ordinary enemies, like political enemies, they can go take over another country or another area, like we have Ukraine war or whatever. They seize the power and then they return again to challenge you. But afflictions are not like this. So once you've expelled them completely, there is no country, there is no land where they can retreat to, or from where they can return, because they need a mind to reside in. So once we're able to route them, they stay routed. We become so much more empowered by that. We don't need to fear that they're going to return so swiftly. And every time, if they do return, they return weaker, successively weaker. The more we're able to reduce them, they never come back stronger. However, we need to sustain joyous perseverance, happy. We need to be happy to get rid of these. Otherwise, we will not have the sharp weapons of joyful perseverance to prevent this. And Je Rinpoche then cites Shantideva saying, "My eye of wisdom eradicates these various afflictions, and once cleared from my mind, they have nowhere to go. From where can they regroup? Where could they counter? From where can they counterattack? But of weak mind, I have no joyous perseverance at all." So he's saying the last line is basically, if my mind is weak, then I'm not able to sustain this eye of wisdom, this attack. And then Newland says, when a negative mind arises, don't be indolent. Stop, lazy. Stop it immediately with its remedy. So overturn it. If you feel hostility, generate love. If you feel jealousy, and so on, right? If you cannot overcome it, then stop thinking about it. Right? Change your mind. Um, do something like make a mandala offering, or make some offerings to people around you, to the teacher or to your companions, to the chosen deities, or focus on, if your affliction won't go, if it keeps on coming in mind, then you can recite mantras of wrathful deities, like on Vajrapani Hung is a wrathful is like a power mantra, and doing this will cause the affliction to disappear. And then Langri Tangpa says, even changing the place where you sit, and sometimes even just turning your head, can make the affliction disappear. So sometimes it's like, I just have to turn my head. And Jeremy says he really struggled. He says that Langri Tangpa really suffered from, struggled with his afflictions. They always popped up in his head because he was like this. But it was like, he was able to get rid of them. And then there's this other thing which I personally love, which is that when a teacher, where no matter however many times he would meet the same person, even in a day, he would always start off not just "How are you?" but he says, "Oh, so meanwhile, have you got a good mind?" So he was like, "How's your mind?" And this is what he would always ask. And then Jeremy Boucher says, of the six root afflictions, the greatest is ignorance and the most tenacious, and it serves as the basis of all of those. Therefore, as a remedy of ignorance, we need to meditate on dependent arising, the 12 links that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Understand how karma arises and how our actions cause consequences. I think this is very powerful even in this life, to think of how our actions make consequences. We don't need to think about the future samsara. We can see it even in this life, right? And then that helps us to think, okay, I need to do better, and also to think everything we do is being watched by others, or will be watched by others, because there is nothing that we do that won't come out later on somewhere or another. So being aware of that, we need to think about, how do I want to set an example? This reminds me actually of somebody who was talking about the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, who is very strong, very deeply practitioner of Lamrim. He is incredibly, has a strong faith in this text, the Lam Rim Chenmo, and His Holiness lives according to the Lam Rim, and he is very, very careful about always presenting a cheerful, happy disposition, and keeping the quality of his discipline as carefully as possible. And and he's very willing to immediately admit when he's made a mistake, and he doesn't hide from that. Um, and one of the things that's interesting is if we think about this as a quality of Lam Rim, this is a Lam Rim practitioner, right? And um, when somebody made a joke, a stand-up comedian made a joke about the Dalai Lama, and somebody else said, it's just not funny. It's like, killing Bambi, because His Holiness has put so much work into being good and kind that sort of using him as the butt of a joke just doesn't work very well. And this sort of quality is amazing. It's like shows just how powerful we can be if we are able to sustain our practice. And it says, then after ignorance, which we need to develop through understanding, then hostility. Ignorance is the main reason for us is ignorance provides us with the block from seeing what's going on. Right? It's very simple. If we want to have experiential understanding, we have to clear the cloud. We need to remove the cloud. Then we can see it. Then when we can see it, things become much easier for us. So when the cloud's there, we can't see anything very easy. It's all black and dark and misty and crazy and chaotic, and we can't see anything. So if we're able to do this, to see through, to understand practically, experientially what we're talking about, then everything becomes clear. Then after that, hostility is the enemy that brings suffering in. He says both in this life and the future lives, and it destroys our benefits. Nobody likes somebody who is filled with hostility. It destroys both ourselves and our enemies. And it says attachment, craving, this craving mind. It strengthens both our good virtue, our virtuous actions, and our non-virtuous actions in a manner which binds us to samsara. So while we are working with attachment, even if what we're doing is done out of a wish for enlightenment, in fact, all it does is drag us back down into samsara. So the point about this is that uh, um, while hostility actually causes harm, causes suffering directly, attachment prevents us, keeps us back, keeps us bound. And then he says also we need to be aware of the thoughts of being attached to desirable objects, and this is he says it's very easy for us to develop sense attachments, and we've got to work on this. Now Je Rinpoche quotes Vasubandhu and who says this is the bit I have to do some research on about Indian folklore. The five beings, the deer, elephants, and now the text here says butterflies, but in fact it's moths. Deer, elephants, moths, fish, and honeybees are overcome by five desirable objects. So if a single desirable object can overcome each one of them, why shouldn't all five destroy somebody who dwells on them? And so what he's saying is that for us, we've got to be free from sense attachment. So I was a bit concerned. I thought, well, there's no comment here about what these are, and so I had to find. In fact, I found a comment from the Krishna because Krishna consciousness, because Prabhupada taught this in when he was giving teachings on the Bhagavad Gita, and this is not just Buddhist. These five animals come from now. Vasubandhu predates any talk from the Bhagavata by about 500 years. So it's not as if we can say he took it from there. The Puranas were generally considered to have been written after Vasubandhu. But we do know that this idea was strong in India, and this is and it relates to all of the Sramana traditions in India. So the deer is given an example because of the sense of sound. the deer is attached to the sense of sound, and specifically, this is to do with flutes. I didn't know this until today, until I looked it up. Basically, a deer is fascinated by and entranced by flute music. And if it hears in a distance flute music, it will come closer to listen to it, and then it will sit down and relax and just listen to the flute music. And unfortunately, this was used by hunters for an easy kill. Yeah. So it was a way of being able to hunt deer was by playing flute music, and this would entrance the deer, and then the flutist, the flute player's mate would stab him or to capture the deer. I don't want anybody to start thinking, "Oh, I'm going to try that," right? But this is actually, and then it turned out this is something that was also known in America by the indigenous Indians there, the Native Americans. But it's also been found in other countries, which was that, yeah, you can use flute to captivate a deer's mind. And this was what he was saying, Hivasabala was saying here, is that deer are attracted to sound. They're so attracted to sound that they will end up dying because of it. And an elephant, so we've got deer, elephant, moth, fish, and bees, right? Elephant have a strong attachment to touch. Now, this is normally done because a bull elephant would be lured into a pit, into an elephant pit, by using a tame cow who is in estrus, right, on heat. So what they do is they'd find a bull elephant who is elephant who is in must, and then they'd put a female elephant close by, and the bull elephant would just go straight for it without even thinking twice. So there's a strong sexual desire would lead him directly into the trap, and and then what they would do is there's a way in which the Indians would force an elephant out of mast by essentially dehydrating the elephant, not giving him any water. So he's trapped in a pit, and they dehydrate the elephant for a week, and then they can control him. You can't control an elephant in mast otherwise. So this is attachment to the sense of touch, and then the moth is well known to be attracted to candles, yeah, and so it's fascinated by light, and therefore it's the sense of sight which a moth has no control of, and the moth will see a flame and will quite happily or unhappily sacrifice itself into that flame. And this was used a lot by poets in India. And the fish is attracted to taste because it sees it sees the worm on the end of the hook of the fisherman, and it's like, ooh, nice, tasty worm. So it goes for that, and off it goes, and that's the end of that. So this is why the fish is used to represent, in this particular case, represent the attachment to taste. And the bee is attracted to the smell of nectar in the flower. So he goes around collecting the nectar and putting it into a great store. And the wild honeybee has this big store of honey. And then, of course, people come along and burn down their nice hive and steal all their honey and often destroy the bees. So this is like the smell. So we have these are the five animals: sound for deer, a touch for elephant, light for moth, a sight for moth, taste for fish, and smell for honeybees. This is a very, very traditional, old, ancient Indian correlation symbol, not just Buddhist correlation between how the five animals are attracted or meet their end through their attachment to a particular sense. Very nice. So then he's saying, we need to be aware of this. And he says, but Je Rinpoche says, not only the five sense objects do we need to be aware of in terms of sustaining. I mean, I think there is more than one human who would say, yeah, I'd die for chocolate. So, so it's not too unusual. So I'm not sure they mean it, but yeah. And then the others is like he says, not only are these sense objects cravings, but also for gain, for wealth, um, and fame, and praise and honor, and like medals or OBEs, right? Praise and pleasure in terms of just hedonic enjoyment. Um, and their dislike of the opposite, becoming losing one's wealth, becoming infamous, becoming a pariah, social pariah, and pain. These are these cravings are very, very quick to occur and very hard to get rid of once they've set in. And we need to stop these. Are known as the 8 worldly concerns, and these we have to cut. We have to cut them. And the best way to do this, it says, particularly, is mindfulness of death. These things just last a life. They're not even relevant to anything. But so he says mindfulness of death is a very, very good way for us to cut this, but also to think about the fact that this is all just weird outgrowths of samsaric mind. Yeah, and it's not even relevant. Same way as we were talking about the other day about oh, what does look at Mr. Jones's new swimming pool. I've got to get a new swimming pool. This is just a samsaric sort of weirdness is not suitable. So this is craving. Then he says, eliminate pride. Pride is the chief obstacle to the development of the path in this lifetime, and tends to lead to low rebirth. Pride and arrogance is destructive because they do not allow for humility, and they do not allow for the ability to listen. We become filled with our own sense of puff, that we're not able to really empathize or understand or listen to what's happening around us. And it also it means we have this sense of superiority that we don't have. Where we can talk about maybe when we're an Arya being, when we're enlightened on the when we have direct insight into emptiness, then maybe we could say we're superior. There's literally the meaning of Arya is superior or noble. Um, uh, but then when we are there, we won't say we won't be proud. So let's not worry about that. There's a doubt. So we're going through the 6 core problems, right? We've done ignorance, hostility, attachment, or craving. Uh, um, uh, we're now doing pride and doubt, right? And he says the way to help us with doubt is primarily to develop certainty, and certainty is found through experience and recollecting experience, which is based upon essentially reframing and understanding what it is that we've seen or experienced, putting it into light and understanding it in terms of its relationship and the truth value it has in the Four Noble Truths. So maybe we should have done 6. And then he says, okay, and then after that is the secondary afflictions, like sleep, lethargy, excitement, laziness, carelessness, shamelessness, forgetfulness, lack of vigilance. They're all basically about not sustaining a vigilance or mindfulness, or being lazy. Lazy here means to not want to do something because one just can't be bothered. Not doing because one isn't comfortable doing it. One finds it hard. Not doing something because one believes one is unable to do it. So these are the 3 aspects of laziness. And there it's the exact polar opposite of joyous effort. So effort is um, wanting to do it, deciding to do it, being determined to do it, enjoying doing it, and feeling able to do it. So this is how these 2 correlate. Lethargy is like just wanting just to lie around all day and so on. And Nagarjuna's friendly letter says excitement, regret, malice, lethargy, and sleep longing for the desirable and doubt, understand that these five obscurations are the robbers who steal the riches of virtue. Those who take pleasure in sleep and lethargy are confused, and their aspirations towards practice fade. These lose all their good qualities, their virtues degenerate, and they fall into darkness. Being careless, not sustaining vigilance, right, is or mindfulness. Being it says carelessness are childish people who ruin their minds. As master traders guard their wealth, so should the wise take care. So this is primarily, he says, we need to sustain, keep away from these afflictions, which we've addressed in different ways over the last year. No, 9 months, 8 months, and in all of these different ways, we need to try to do our best to practice against them, and then, of course, also train in meditation, in samatha, in developing a peaceful mind. He says if we're not even able to, we might find it very difficult to stop some of these. Some of the stronger ones we might have some success with. Some of the more subtle ones are much harder to do. He says if we cannot stop or the afflictions or even the secondary, it's good to recognize that they are your enemies, even if so not to strengthen them and not to take their side. So if we recognize, even if we're not able to stop our desire for fame, to recognize that fame is an empty, useless thing, and not want to take the side of it, helps to diminish it in terms of its a power over us, for instance, right? And then another one, this is a disciple of Atisha, Lord Atisha says, if you were to ask all of your students or your practitioners, what are you practicing? What's your primary purpose of your practice? And they would often say, "Oh, I want to have the super knowledges of a Buddha, or I want to have a vision of Manjushri or my deity." He said, "But they shouldn't be saying this. They should be saying what I really want is become more definite about the effects of actions of my actions." And then also learning how to keep pure what vows I have. So this is really the first hurdle and the worst hurdle. Once we've done this, once we can establish a strong discipline, then everything else is much easier. But we have to do it. There's no other way. And it says, sometimes you might feel this is a bit of a hardship. And he says, but for instance, he says, when people fight with others, when we're involved in a bit of fight, um, something that has no value whatsoever, and it just leads to suffering, but for both me and my opponent. He says it's just a normal fight. We'll endure all sorts of suffering. We'll get all, we'll be beaten and possibly have a fight, sort of be furious and so on. And then at the end of it, we'll sort of show off our scars. Look, this is the one I got from, that fight I had with whatever, yeah, with whoever. Yeah, look. And he says, look, this is what I did at such and such a time. And he said, therefore, it's really important for us to allow ourselves to undergo whatever hardships it takes in our practice. He says, if we wish to be conquering heroes, we should scorn our suffering and defeat our enemies of like hostility. Everybody else are just killing corpses because in the end we all die, right? So he says, this in the end, this is the end. explanation of the stages of the path that are shared with the people of medium capacity. In other words, the middle scope, or the side of the main structure of the pyramid. So this there in the end was the end of volume 1. And I thank you so much for sharing it with me as much as you were able, or I was able. And next will be to look at volume 2, which covers the bodhicitta, developing the bodhisattva mind and sustaining the bodhisattva mind, and the 6 perfections and then again, in the end of the 6 perfections, just like we've had with a middle scope on the 3 higher trainings, he says, okay, and here's a brief discussion of the concentration and wisdom, and then he does volume 3 is concentration wisdom, which is what Je Rinpoche wants to concentrate on. But he spent the first large volume mainly giving us the first 2 volumes are based primarily on developing ethical practice, right? The mind and our actions in terms of how to be good, how to live our lives. So, and then also the end of this semester 2. So we'll carry on bodhicitta and the bodhisattva path in semester 3. But right now, we're getting on a bit now, to dedicate any merit to any benefits from this talk that have to inspire us to be active, to sustain our practice in even the smallest way, to be generous in our hearts, to be considerate, be kind, and to stay on the path as much as we're able until we're in a position to achieve our goal of Buddhahood, to benefit all beings, both now, throughout the path, and at the end of the path. So we're always doing our best to benefit all beings, both now, in our path, and at the end of our path. No, thank you very much. So let's just sit for a couple of minutes and to contemplate how we may act and implement being good, doing the very best we can